Welcome everyone to Mendota After Hours. Excuse me. Tonight's presentation, Faribault and Sibley at Mackinac, is presented by Craig Wilson. And I'm Laurence Cote-Cournoyer, the Sibley Historic Site Supervisor here in Mendota. We have people joining mainly from Minnesota this evening, the ancestral and contemporary land of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other Native nations. If you're not familiar with Dakota County Historical Society, we operate 3 historic sites: the Sibley Historic Sites here, the Leduc Historic Estate in Sibley in Hastings, and the Lashy Memorial Museum in South St. Paul. I'll just share my screen really quick for our sponsor, which are the friends of the Sibley Historic Site. They're sponsoring this whole series this year, and we thank them for their support. For questions or comments during the presentation, you can type them in the chat. The icon is at the bottom of your screen towards the middle, and I'll read the question to Craig at the end. And tonight's presentation will last about an hour, and we are recording it. So for anyone who missed it tonight or want to watch it again, once we upload it to our YouTube channel, I'll send the link to everybody. And let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Craig is the Chief Curator for Mackinac State Historic Parks, a family of living history sites in northern Michigan. He supervises museum operations throughout the park system. Craig, thank you for being here this evening.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And I guess I'm going to start to share my screen as well. And hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, so we're going to spend a little while here just talking about these two people who are pretty important in Minnesota history and I guess in Midwestern history in the late 18th and well into the 19th centuries, and about their connections to Mackinac, because there are many, as we were discussing before we opened the floor up for all of you to join. It's not like Faribault and Sibley just appeared in Minnesota, that it was just one part of long careers for both of them. And both of those careers in many ways began at Mackinac, and they intertwined in some really interesting ways, which we'll discuss. So just full disclosure, I'm going to be talking very much about the Mackinac end of things, to kind of place their early careers, their earlier lives in context. I know these, both of them are, again, very regionally important, depending on what you're looking at, whether it's, being the governor or, being heavily involved in trade or relations with the indigenous people. And I'll touch on all of that, but again, I'm going to focus very much on what they were doing at Mackinac and how that led them further west, further south, further north. Now, why would they have come from Mackinac? Why was this place where we are right now, and it's where the red dot is? So if you're not familiar, Mackinac is, it can refer to any number of things, historically Mackinac or Michilimackinac, those words both refer to the same thing. That could refer to the whole region here in the Straits of Mackinac, where Lakes Michigan and Huron come together. It could refer specifically to Mackinac Island, which we'll talk about here in a little while. It could refer to the town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that's now known as St. Ignace, which is at the north end of the Mackinac Bridge, which you can see in this nice painting here over my shoulder. Could also refer to Mackinac City, which is at the south end of the bridge, and that's where I am right now. This place has been very important to a variety of people for a very, very long period of time. Talking about pre-contact history, what the Anishinaabe and other indigenous people were doing here, they were using this as a gathering place. After Europeans arrived pretty early on in the 17th century, they too used it as a gathering place. And as you can see from the map here, it's because it's centrally located. This is kind of in the middle of the upper Great Lakes. From this spot, if you are motivated enough, you can go almost anywhere in the Great Lakes watershed, which both Faribault and Sibley did, as we will discuss here in a little while. You can, follow the rivers that flow into Lake Superior, or especially into Lake Michigan, to access the Mississippi and follow that down to the Gulf of Mexico. You can get up to the Arctic Circle in Hudson Bay from here, and kind of the major highway connecting Mackinac to the rest of the world for much of history is not I-75, which runs the length of Michigan and all the way down to Florida. Instead, it's the St. Lawrence, linking them to the Atlantic and literally the rest of the world. So this place, again, has always been somewhere that people are settling, passing through, using as a meeting place to trade with one another. The Anishinaabe are utilizing it as a sacred space, and they continue to do so today. Again, it's geographic location just astride these Great Lakes, where it's very easy. If you turn right, you're in Lake Huron. If you turn left, you're in Lake Michigan. Lake Superior is about 40 miles away from here. And then, of course, you can also go down the lakes to Lakes Erie and Ontario. That's why this place has been inhabited by so many different people for such a long period of time. Again, because of the water. So in terms of European settlement, that gets started here, in a permanent sense. In the mid-17th century, there is a Jesuit mission established on Mackinac Island in 1670 that moves to the Upper Peninsula in 1671. It's the mission of St. Ignace, so that's where we get that community. They're celebrating their 350th anniversary this year. That community remained over there until the early part of the 18th century, when it relocated to the South Shore, where Mackinac City is today. There, around 1715, the French colonial government constructed a small fortification alongside an existing Odawa village and that Jesuit mission, and named it Michilimackinac. Again, that name applies to so many different things. That remained a French controlled post until 1760, at which point it, along with the rest of New France or French Canada, passed to British control. And so what you're looking at here is the fort and community of Michilimackinac, because it truly was a community, a fortified community, not just a military outpost, as it appeared in 1765. And just for everyone's reference, north is at the bottom here. So the blue is the Straits of Mackinac. This is actually just right across the street from where I'm sitting right now. Now, this spot, as it had been for hundreds of years prior, again, was a gathering place. It was, again, not only a military outpost, a place where the British attempted to project imperial power, in a much larger sense, in a much more important sense. It was also a place of trade. This is a transshipment point. So a variety of trade goods would come in here. All sorts of manufactured items would be shipped here. And from this spot, from Michilimackinac, it could be distributed out across the western Great Lakes, up north of Lake Superior, down into the Illinois country, wherever there were indigenous people that the British and French were trading with. A lot of those trade goods came from here. This was also a collection point for furs that were being purchased with all those trade goods. They'd be consolidated, sorted, repackaged here, and then shipped back east, again, primarily through the river system running out of the eastern part of Lake Huron, through Georgian Bay, up into Lake Nipissing, and then into the Mattawa and Ottawa rivers down to the St. Lawrence, just upstream from Montreal. So again, this is a thriving place, lots of people here. Again, the predominant population would have been Anishinaabe, so Odawa primarily, as well as Ojibwa, some Potawatomi. But they are all working together again to make this place an economic center. And it truly is one of the centers of the Great Lakes fur trade for a couple hundred years. But there are some problems with this community from a purely military standpoint. And as you get into the 1770s, talking about the era of the American Revolution, There's a concern that, yes, this is a fort, but it's a fort, in the barest sense of the word. It has just a wooden palisade around it. It's located right down here on the water. Great for a transshipment point for waterborne transportation. Not so great if you're looking at it from, any type of military strong point. And so beginning in 1779, the British officials here made the decision to relocate everything that we were just looking at, that whole community, the fortifications, all of the civilian homes, the military structures. They made the decision to move that over to Mackinac Island, which sits just out here in the Straits of Mackinac, about 7 miles away. They built a whole new community over there. We'll talk more about that momentarily. They built a new fortification over there, Fort Mackinac, which you can see in the picture here. If you've been to Mackinac Island, it's hard to miss. It's up 150 feet on a bluff overlooking the harbor as well as the town. Over about a 3-year period, that whole community was moved over to the island, and anything that could not be burned or they didn't want to take with them, they burned down. So there really was no longer a mainland community over here after 1781. Again, the British, both military and civilians, the French Canadian population who never went anywhere when the British took over, they moved over there. Obviously, the Anishinaabe didn't go anywhere either. And this continued to function in much the same way as those mainland communities had, again, as a military center, a diplomatic center, but primarily as an economic center for that Great Lakes fur trade, just in a slightly different location. Now, technically, American Revolution ends 1783. This was all part of American territory at that point in time for a variety of reasons. The Americans just didn't show up, and the British didn't go anywhere. So this remained British territory for another 13 years until 1796. But that brings us just about up to the appearance of the first of the people that we're going to talk about. But in just a moment, I forgot I had this slide. Again, talking about everything moving by water, you can see here, stuff is primarily being moved by canoe. There were very few sailing vessels on the upper lakes in the 18th century, even into the early 19th century. The first steamboat appears right around 1820, the walk in the water. By and large, this trade, all the movement, of people, things, ideas, is taking place in large canoes like you see here, or potentially bateaus, which are just large flat bottom rowboats. A big canoe like the one that we're paddling around here takes maybe 12 people to paddle, and total cargo, including the people, could carry perhaps 4 tons. These things are about 40 feet long. So these are kind of the workhorses of trade. So when we talk about people moving around, when we talk about the fur trade, talk about the stuff that Faribault and Sibley are moving around, it's moving in vessels just like this. And again, you can see our reconstruction of Michilimackinac in this picture, and it is right down on the water. So again, very conveniently located to facilitate that trade. But anyway, getting again to the first of our 2 subjects tonight, Jean-Baptiste Faribault, and just a bit of background. Again, he's born 1774. As a young man, he worked in a variety of trading houses in Quebec. At one point, it appears that he was offered a commission in, I believe it was the 7th Regiment, the British regiment that was garrisoning that part of Canada in the 1790s. Apparently, he was an amateur artist, and that had drawn the attention of some of the officers. He turned that down, apparently at the urging of his family, and continued in business because there's a whole other part of the fur trade that he would have been involved in those populated cities in Quebec and in Montreal, because that's where all this stuff is coming from. That's where all those trade goods are coming from. That's where the voyageurs, the people paddling those canoes, manning those bateaus, they're largely being hired from the St. Lawrence River Valley in that part of Canada. And there are trading firms that spring up, especially by the end of the 18th century. You see formalized partnerships between traders to pool their resources, to buy trade goods, to hire employees, to acquire the necessary permits, to come out here into the West and trade. They, again, are not only supplying the fur trade, but they are also acting in many ways as clearinghouses for everything else. If you, for instance, just lived out here at Mackinac and you wanted a new set of clothes, if you wanted furniture, if you wanted specific types of food, you could write to agents of these various trading houses, and they would procure that for you. They might in turn write to agents of other trading firms. Almost everything would have been done on credit. So a lot of these trading houses, or in some cases, individual traders were acting as private banks. That was how you acquired stuff out here. And again, by the end of the 18th century, this is a well-established system. You do see formalized companies, maybe none as widespread as, for instance, the American Fur Company, which we'll talk more about when we discuss Sibley. But this would not have been, a rare instance for a trading house to hire a young man to act as a clerk, handling basic accounting, that sort of thing. As letters come in, there are always, again, credit accounts to be balanced. People are apparently always in debt, trying to get out of debt, trying to transfer debt around. And so there would have been a lot of opportunities for a young man in that business environment, but there would also be opportunities to take a more active role in the trade, to actually come out here into the West, out to Mackinac or further west or north or south, and actually get into the business of buying and selling these goods that would have been passing through those large cities out east. So by 1798, Faribault appears to have been employed by one of those firms, a partnership of Parker, Girard, and Ogilvy. These partnerships were sometimes short-lived. A little bit earlier on in the 18th century, they may have only lasted a season or two. You would see merchants, again, pooling their resources. They wouldn't formally incorporate or anything like that. It was more of a handshake agreement. You start to see formalized companies, in the mid 1780s, so like the Northwest Company is like 1784, drawn from a lot of the merchants actually here at Mackinac. And that just continues to grow. The business history of a lot of these firms gets very, very complicated very quickly, because you'll see partners spin off, start other partnerships, businesses break up, they grow. And so it can get a little bit difficult to track. But in any case, again, by 1798, Faribault was employed by one of those trading firms and sent out here to Mackinac. Now, again, as I mentioned, Mackinac, by the time he arrived out here, had been in American hands since 1796. American troops arrived September 1st, 1796, to establish military and civil authority. This is one of the very last places in the United States that was turned over actually to the United States, as we mentioned, about 13 years late. But it remained a center of the Great Lakes fur trade, but it was also this very important administrative and military center. This was, quote unquote, the frontier. This is, kind of as far as major American civilization had pushed out at that point in time. Obviously, there had been people here much, much longer than that. Europeans had been out here much, much longer than that, just on their own. But for the new United States, this is one of their most remote outposts and also one of the most important. So for instance, by 1803, Fort Mackinac is one of the largest posts, the largest military installations in the country. But you have to take that with a grain of salt, because at the time that Faribault was here, the American government is undergoing a lot of changes, as you see a transition from John Adams' presidency to Thomas Jefferson's presidency. They had very different ideas about the role of federal government. And Jefferson very much contracted the federal government. He made it much smaller. So one of the largest posts in the country was manned by 120 soldiers. Not actually that big, but again, they realized that it was an important place. This is, again, a center of trade, but it's also a major point of contact with the indigenous groups of the Western Great Lakes. Again, primarily Anishinaabe, but there are people coming from what's now Wisconsin, from Minnesota, out into the Dakotas, up from the North Shore of Lake Superior, up from the Illinois country. Those people, just as they had been for generations, were still coming here, and the federal American government was using Mackinac as a place to interface with them. So when Faribault arrived here in 1798, this would have been a bustling community over there on Mackinac Island, with people coming and going on a daily basis. The summertime would have been very much the busy season, just as it still is for us today. Thousands of people coming and going, potentially on a daily basis. Because again, everybody's moving by water. You can't really travel too much when the lakes are frozen. But as he came out here and got involved in the trade, he, like many others before him, used Mackinac as a base of operations to go out to indigenous communities, to satellite trading posts, to actually do the buying and selling of furs. So, his first winter out here, he wintered in the Illinois country. He actually spent most of his time in the South and West. There are a lot of other people who use Mackinac as a base of operations to, go up into the Canadian plains, as far as the Canadian Rockies. It just depends on where the business partners that they were working for, where they had kind of staked out as their territory. Following that, he spent a couple of winters at the Des Moines River. But then in 1802, he moved to the Little Rapids on the Minnesota River, where he would kind of set up his permanent presence in Minnesota. And that's where, in that part of the country, as well as into Wisconsin, that's where he would remain for basically the rest of his life. Now, up to this point, again, he's working for business partners, different trading firms. But after 1809, he was in business on his own at Prairie du Chien, which is another one of these kind of gathering places, and had a trading settlement there that he maintained. Now, here's just a look from the late 1790s at what Mackinac would have looked like when he was here. This is drawn by a couple of American officers soon after they arrived in 1796. So, up here at the top, you see Fort Mackinac up on that bluff. It's about 150 feet up. Here you see the only natural harbor on Mackinac Island. So you can see why they wanted to situate all of this where they did. Again, everything is based on waterborne commerce. But then you also see the village. Again, this is all moved over from the mainland at Michilimackinac, a variety of civilian homes, a variety of businesses down here. And in the summertime, this would have been a bustling place, a very busy place. And, I mentioned that there's all sorts of different words that are used, or variations of the same word. You can see how they have very kind of creatively spelled Michilimackinac here. There are dozens and dozens of different ways to spell Michilimackinac, sometimes involving K's and Q's, but that's neither here nor there. Just kind of a fun little bit of trivia. But in any case, Faribault's trading at Prairie du Chien is interrupted by the War of 1812, which has a variety of connections back to Mackinac. In July of 1812, Mackinac was actually recaptured by the British, because in 1796, when the Americans took over, the British didn't go very far. They too wanted to maintain a presence in this region. They had well-developed contacts with the Anishinaabe and other indigenous groups. They had their own trade partnerships, diplomatic partnerships. They wanted to maintain all that. So they only went about 40 miles away from here, up to the northeast, to a place called St. Joseph's Island, just across the border in Canada. And they bid their time. They continued maintaining all of these various partnerships that they had established over the preceding decades. Actually, beginning in about 1807, they had very comprehensive war plans laid out for what would happen if they went to war with the United States, because they figured that was coming. And in June of 1812, when the United States declared war on Great Britain for a variety of complicated and maybe not the most logical reasons, the British put those plans into action, and they relied upon people like Robert Dixon, who is another trader operating out in the West, operating at Prairie du Chien and a variety of other places, relying upon those traders to bring in just massive numbers of indigenous men to bolster their military numbers. And on July 17th, they showed up on Mackinac Island, took the high ground behind Fort Mackinac, and told the American garrison to surrender or else, because there were about 600 of them up there on the high ground and about 60 soldiers inside the fort. The commanding officer, a man named Porter Hanks, had no idea that there was even a war going on. No one had bothered to tell him. And so he surrendered. And he's actually going to show up in our story again. That's why I mention him right now. But with the British in control of Mackinac, that again opened up much of the Midwest once again to British control. And Robert Dixon, again, that trader, was placed in nominal control under the commanding officer at Mackinac of that territory that Faribault had been inhabiting and trading in. Now, the Americans wanted to come back. They wanted to retake the Great Lakes. They wanted to retake Mackinac. That's a whole other story. They were able to recapture Prairie du Chien in June of 1814, but the British very quickly recaptured it once again a month later in July. And the British troops that recaptured Prairie du Chien are dispatched from Mackinac. The commanding officer here, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDowell, realized the importance of the river systems out there, the trade networks that Faribault was a part of, and so sent a mixed force from Mackinac, again, a lot of native men, but also local merchants, traders. They're kind of grouped together into a unit called the Michigan Fencibles, and they're able to recapture Prairie du Chien from the Americans. Now, while all this was going on, Faribault remained, it seems, pretty studiously neutral. When the British showed up, he refused to join them. He refused to link up with William McKay, who was the officer dispatched from Mackinac by McDowell to actually take command of that region. He also appears to not really have cooperated a whole lot with Andrew Bulger, who it takes command a little bit later on, another British officer. And again, seems to have remained pretty studiously neutral throughout this whole thing. At the end of the War of 1812 and 1815, all that territory was returned to the United States by treaty. So it didn't matter who had captured what during the war, everything was turned back over. And Faribault became an American citizen following the war and continued his operations out there. His family was out there. They found the town named after him. It's one of his sons, I believe, who did that. And he lived all the way until 1860. And again, I'm not going to get too much into his later life because the Mackinac connections get a little bit more remote from here on out. But again, he, like a lot of people, this was the starting point for their trading career. This is where he would go out and winter from. He'd come back here in the summertime for the trading season. And then just stayed further out later on in much the same way that our next gentleman did, and that's Henry Sibley. So he is of a later generation. He's actually born in Detroit in 1811. So he was present in August 1812 when the British, after their victory at Mackinac a month earlier, were able to capture the fort and community down there. What's kind of interesting is if you look at some of the family lore, obviously he would have been a very small child, so this is not necessarily something that he remembered, but family lore states that he was at Detroit, his father was out commanding a militia company, and when the British and their indigenous allies came across the Detroit River from Canada, they had some perfunctory shelling of the American positions. They were firing artillery. It really caused very little damage. But apparently, one of the cannonballs actually came into the room next to where he was and killed the 3 or 4 American officers who were in there. If that's true, that would have included Porter Hanks, the commander of Fort Mackinac, who had surrendered a month before. He was sent on parole to Detroit. And he initiated a court of inquiry to basically get out there on the record why he had surrendered the fort. Again, outnumbered 10-1, unaware that there was a war on. But before that could proceed, he became one of the very, very few casualties of the capture of Detroit. And again, if family lore is to be believed, Sibley as a child was right there kind of next to him. After the war, he was very classically trained. There was an expectation that he would become a lawyer. He apparently didn't really care for that. And so at a certain point, his parents basically allowed him to pursue whatever career he wanted. And so by 1828, he too entered the trade. First as a clerk in Sault Ste. Marie, which is about 60 miles north of here, where Lake Superior runs down into the St. Mary's River, which runs down into Lake Huron. Another one of these places where there had been an indigenous presence and a European presence for a very long time by the 1820s. There was another fort built up there, and Sibley became a clerk to the sutler who was supplying this the garrison there. So, selling necessities to the military. He also came into contact with the Johnston family up there. They were a very prominent family that had both Ojibwa and European members. And so he actually went to work for Susan Johnston, who was an Anishinaabe woman. That family, again, had a very broad reach. They were involved in trade for a very long time. One of her daughters ended up marrying Henry Schoolcraft. If you're at all familiar with 19th century ethnography of indigenous peoples in the Great Lakes, he was also the Indian agent here. So Sibley kind of, again, inserted himself into this pre-existing network, acting as an agent for them, doing purchasing, carrying out transactions and that sort of thing by the end of the 1820s. Now, by the time he was operating up here, Mackinac itself had changed a bit from that kind of frontier garrison that Faribault would have discovered in the 1790s. After the War of 1812, Mackinac truly exploded into a commercial hub and on a much more developed scale and truly on a global scale. It had always been global, but Mackinac, by the time that he got up into this area, would have been dominated by 3 institutions. The American military at Fort Mackinac, still again a primary point of contact in terms of military force as well as diplomacy. The Mackinac Indian Agency, which is again the critical touch point for federal outreach to tribes from all over the Western Great Lakes, and the American Fur Company. By this point in time, those little partnerships that we mentioned in the 18th century had been consolidated. They had grown. They had really developed into much, much larger corporations, and the largest of which at Mackinac was the American Fur Company, led by John Jacob Astor, America's first millionaire. But at the same time, even though commercial development is kind of at its height on Mackinac at this time, the fur trade is actually waning in this area. Keep in mind, Europeans have been purchasing furs from indigenous trappers in this area for like almost 200 years at this point in time. People had to go further and further west, further and further north to find new sources of fur. And so even though the American Fur Company, as we'll see here in just a minute, had a massive complex on the island. It's actually the Northern Department headquarters. Robert Stewart, who is perhaps the least happy person in history, judging by any image that I've ever seen of him, also appears to have had quite a temper if you read other accounts. He was the manager here, and he really oversaw the expansion of the American Fur Company's base on Mackinac Island. They were diversifying into a variety of other business ventures, especially fishing. Mackinac would come to be a hub of commercial fishing as you get into the 1840s. The American Fur Company has its fingers in all of that. But this is the milieu, the kind of the world that Sibley would have found himself thrust into when he arrived here. Again, between 1819 and 1822, the AFC built just a huge complex on Mackinac Island. It's everything from a retail store, basically a company store, to a series of warehouses. There was an agent's residence, so that's where Stewart would have lived. There was a very, very large dormitory for the clerks, people who would have been keeping the books and recording all of this. And much of that infrastructure is still there. If you've been on Mackinac Island and you've walked down Market Street, which is the second street in the downtown area, all those AFC buildings are still very much there. A couple of them have been demolished, but there's just this massive presence is still visible today. And this is just another artistic look by Seth Eastman at what Mackinac would have looked like when Sibley arrived here about 1829. So you can see Fort Mackinac up there on the hill. You can see the Mackinac Indian Agency. Those are the buildings kind of at the lower right. And then you can also see parts of the American Fur Company infrastructure. So this large building down kind of at the base of that triangle coming down from the fort, that is the American Fur Company retail store. And that is where Sibley would have come to work because he accepted an apprenticeship as a clerk and storekeeper for the American Fur Company in 1829. So he came down here from Sault Ste. Marie and began to work again, very much in the company store. That was a place where employees could buy all sorts of goods. Also, just island residents could buy all sorts of goods there. It's too bad from a narrative standpoint that he showed up in 1829. That store is also the site in 1822 of a pretty famous accident involving a voyager named Alexis St. Martin that allowed the post surgeon William Beaumont to carry out a series of groundbreaking experiments upon human digestion. And that's kind of how we figured out how our stomachs worked. But again, that's another story. But he spent a couple of years, at least in the summertime, working at the retail store. It seems that he would return to Detroit and work in banks in the wintertime. He had, I think it was a 5-year agreement to work for the AFC. He eventually took on a variety of other roles, including in 1832, going to Detroit to speak to the territorial government and the territorial governor of Michigan to secure trade licenses, to ensure that the AFC could continue operating all of its various businesses. Also beginning in 1832 through 1834, he was a purchasing agent, again, based at Mackinac, but traveling as far afield as Ohio, trying to purchase goods on behalf of the AFC for use in their store at Mackinac and also in their operations elsewhere. Now, by 1834, this is a year before his apprenticeship was up, he actually asked to be released from it. But Ramsey Crooks, who was another high-ranking AFC official, basically refused. He refused to let him out of his contract. And instead offered him a partnership in the American Fur Company's Western outfit, because this is a time when the American Fur Company is they are diversifying, but it's also starting to splinter into a variety of different things. Because again, the fur trade, at least the Mackinac trade, was really on the decline at this point in time, despite all the improvements that they had made in the 1820s. They had enjoyed a tremendous amount of success. The trade was on the decline. John Jacob Astor had gotten out of the business, and control had largely passed to Ramsey Crooks, one of his lieutenants. And so Sibley was actually offered this new partnership that would be operating in what's now Minnesota, based at Mendota. and he would be the junior partner with two other men, John Joseph Roulette and Hercules Dousman, who you see in the photo right here. Dousman in particular is kind of an interesting character. His family was very, very prominent on Mackinac Island. His father, Michael Dousman, who is perhaps more famous both here and in Wisconsin, was very much involved in the trade. He had gained a great deal of notoriety during the War of 1812 because he probably under duress, he discovered the British invasion fleet coming down to capture Fort Mackinac in 1812. And the British made him go warn the civilians, but he had to swear not to warn the garrison at Fort Mackinac, and he held his word. People were always a little suspicious of him after that, particularly because he was not required to swear an oath of allegiance to Great Britain during the war. He just got to stay. Everybody else had to swear allegiance to the king or were removed. But after the war, he was rehabilitated. And again, his business interests extended all over the place. He ran a sawmill over here near Mackinac City. They had mills over in Wisconsin. And again, his son entered that business as well. So by partnering with these two other men as part of this AFC kind of both expansion and also division, Sibley was ideally positioned to continue to be a successful trader after the AFC ultimately went defunct in the 1840s. So again, he managed the post at Mendota to serve the local Dakota communities, as well as Fort Snelling. And he was also responsible for a pretty wide net. I think there were 4 satellite posts that were pretty remote from there that also answered to Sibley in his role as a manager. And one of the people working at those remote outposts would have been Jean-Baptiste Faribault. So they kind of circle back together with one another there. And that's, I think, where I'm going to kind of leave our story. Again, Sibley goes on to a variety of other things. He's involved in treaties, land treaties with the local indigenous people. Obviously, he ends up as the governor. He's involved in the Dakota War, heavily involved in the State Historical Society towards the end of his life, actually publishing memoirs from a variety of other early traders, including Faribault. But that doesn't have as much to do with his experiences at Mackinac. So I'll just kind of leave him as a relatively young man as the manager of the AFC outpost at Mendota. But hopefully this has shown, that as I mentioned earlier on, neither of these two men, nor a lot of the people who would end up being involved in the far Western trade, usually they started somewhere else. And in many instances, it's here at Mackinac, because for so long, this had been a center of trade. It had been a natural gathering place for people from time, kind of immemorial. And it really only is by, really the time of Sibley and kind of the middle of Faribault's career that begins to change. And it truly is by the mid of the 19th century, Mackinac is no longer serving in that function. There are places further west in Minnesota, out into the Dakotas, that are serving those same purposes. But for these two, it was a pretty important, stepping stone or pit stop in their later careers as they went on to do other things. But again, that kind of takes us through at least their Mackinac years. If anybody does have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Again, I will warn you, I'm not up necessarily on their later lives. I tried to focus mostly on the Mackinac connections. But again, I'm happy to at least try and answer questions at this point. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you, Craig. And if anyone had a question, you can type them in the chat, or you can also turn on your mic if you want to ask a question directly. But yeah, and we'll go from there, take as many questions as we can for the reminder of this presentation. I saw Anne's mic on, but
Yeah, I do. I'm wondering what kind of records you're looking at in Mackinac to find these records of Faribault and Sibley. I mean, I've seen a few in biographical notations that, yeah, he was at Mackinac, but what kind of records do you have?
So, especially for Sibley's a little bit easier, just because he's involved in the American Fur Company. And you can look at, business records there, just to see his activities, because it truly was a massive corporation, and probably almost too massive, and that's one of the reasons that it ultimately split up. But you're right, you just do a cursory search, and even I believe on the Minnesota Historical Society's webpage, talking about both of them, they're both highlighted there, and it'll say, oh, they were at Mackinac. You just have to, I guess, look at the Mackinac specific sources to find references to them.
Are they there at Mackinac, or are they where?
Most of that stuff, especially the AFC stuff, we do have a lot of the archival stuff. Not necessarily the originals, but we have copies. So we've got a variety of those records. Again, our research interests have largely been confined to their operations on the island. So we don't necessarily follow some of these people afield when they leave here. But we operate the retail store as one of our museum sites on the island. And there our interpretive focus is actually the 1820s and that accident with Beaumont, just because that's kind of internationally important and remains important to us today. But yeah, a lot of those records are out there. Looking, even at the stuff from the Minnesota Historical Society that Sibley was overseeing at the end of the 19th century, looking back at the memoirs and the recollections of those early traders. The Wisconsin Historical Society did the same thing, the Michigan Historical Society. So, if you look at the Wisconsin historical collections or the Michigan Pioneer and historical collections, you'll get these firsthand accounts of what a lot of those early traders were doing. Because again, it was all being collected in the 19th century when those people potentially were still alive.
It's very interesting. I had a question. You mentioned at the beginning the first fort that was basically just a wooden palisade. Are there any remnants of that, or did you just go off of maps that were drawn at the time to locate this first fort?
So it's yes, all the above. So at Michilimackinac over here in Mackinac City, we've actually been doing archaeology every year since 1959. It's one of the longest ongoing archaeological excavations in the country, if not in the Western Hemisphere. We're always trying to track down who's been doing it longer. I think there's something in Mexico City that might be a little bit longer. But yeah, because the community grew over time, they just kept building it on top of itself. It got bigger and bigger. So what we have reconstructed out there right now is essentially that 1765 map that I showed you. That's the fort at its largest extent. That's the fort kind of at the end of its life. But before we reconstruct anything, we do archaeology. So we have just about 60% of the interior of the palisade excavated. That's to say nothing of the extensive suburbs that were outside the fort. I mean, we're not doing it. We're done out there for the season right now. But depending on what, where they're digging, they will absolutely find remnants of that first fort. We have 4 maps of the fort, one from the French period in 1749, and then 3 from the British period in the 1760s. We've got a number of written descriptions throughout that time. So it's a variety of different sources that tell us what it may have looked like.
And I'm guessing that the water might have been where the water was back then to now. There's probably a difference in length there.
No,
or not?
I mean, over the past few years, it was a bit closer because the Great Lakes were incredibly high. They've actually fallen a foot in the past year, and they're still incredibly high. But one of the early British traders, Alexander Henry, who people may be familiar with because he traveled extensively throughout the Midwest and then sort of wrote a book about 40 years later. In 1761, when he arrived here, he said that when the wind is in the west, the waves break upon the wall of the fort. And it was very windy here today, and I can absolutely see, what he's talking about, because we've built essentially on top of the archaeological remains. Once we find something, we rebuild right there. So, yeah.
I see. And then you mentioned that for 30 years, the British remained at Mackinac because the US didn't show up. So, but when they showed up in 1796, it was just like, now we're here and we're
No,
taking
I mean,
over kind of thing?
everyone knew it was coming, and everyone, essentially, really 1781, people could kind of see the writing on the wall that the war in America was not going well, because what people often forget is by that point in time, it's a world war, and this little colonial insurgency is a backwater. They're fighting, their peer state. They're fighting the French as well as the Spanish and the Dutch. But people could kind of see that major combat operations were going to be over in what's now the United States, but the British still had firm control of the Great Lakes, still had firm control of New York City. And when the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, is signed in 1783, there were provisions that required the new American government to, for instance, repay some of the loyalists whose property had been confiscated, their houses burned down, all their stuff stolen. Some of those people were supposed to be reimbursed, but the American government was broke and heavily indebted to the French and the Dutch, so they didn't have any money. They also didn't have an army. At a certain point in time, the American army goes down to fewer than 100 soldiers. I mean, it's just like for a day or two, but that's it. There was not a standing army. And since the British had never been legitimately threatened in any of those places, and the Americans both were not living up to their treaty obligations and did not have the forces to just ignore their treaty obligations, the British government decided to just stay. Because again, they wanted to maintain the relationships that they had built with the indigenous people. Again, military relationships, diplomatic relationships, trade relationships. They wanted to be in this area because whoever was here controlled those relationships, or at least, had a greater stake in those relationships. A lot of those issues got worked out in the mid 1790s. The American Army finally got its act together after being wiped out twice by a British supplied Native Confederacy in Ohio. That Confederacy was finally broken in 1794 at Fallen Timbers. So the Native people, who had really been the ones bearing the brunt of this war, and the British were basically using them as proxies, their willingness to continue that resistance was temporarily paused. It absolutely comes back later on. And there's a variety of treaties, like the Jay Treaty in 1795, that works out a lot of those issues. So everyone knew, like, it wasn't just a surprise. The Americans didn't just show up and say, this is ours now. Everybody knew they were coming.
I see. And during the War of 1812, was the fur trade halted a lot, or did they send shipment out, or did
it continued. And again, that's one of the reasons that the British wanted to control this area. It's curtailed, but it continues. It doesn't just stop, and not everything is given over to the military activities. But yeah, it absolutely continues. The Johnston family, who I mentioned that Sibley ended up working with, they're running a trade station up at Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, it was such an inviting target that in 1814, the Americans on their way to Mackinac went up there and just burned it all down. So yeah, there was absolutely trade still going on here, maybe not as extensively, but it was still a part of the economy.
Great, very interesting. Well, thank you, Craig, so much. Oh, I think we just got a question. Jonathan is asking, besides Sibley and Faribault, were any other well-known historical figures that came through the island around this time?
I guess it depends on your definition of well-known. You know, if you are familiar with, you know, early American history in this area, again, those AFC officials, Ramsey Crooks, Robert Stewart, they are very important. Off the top, again, Dr. Beaumont, William Beaumont, who has, see how many Beaumont hospitals there are around the country. There's a reason for that. You know, it's truly, he's the father of gastric physiology, because again, he kind of figured out what goes on in our stomachs. Yeah, your mileage may vary on who you consider important. Because there were so many people passing through here, but you know, like one of the things that we've tried to think about is, did Abraham Lincoln ever stop here? Maybe, but you know, nothing like Washington slept here or anything like that. Franklin Pierce's brother was the commander at Fort Mackinac for a while, so the brother of the president. Again, your mileage may vary on what you consider important.
Right, so either, and some probably stayed, and then some like Faribault and Sibley just moved on from other areas of the country for the trade.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to see the connection. And 2 weeks ago, we had connections drawn from Prairie du Chien to Mendota, and tonight with Mackinac and Mendota. So thank you for your expertise on that. Thank you everyone who joined tonight, and this was recorded. So once it's uploaded on our YouTube channel, I'll let everybody know, and I'll send an email. And in that email will be a quick link to a survey, and then you can help us make our presentations better. Stay tuned, sorry, for our next Mendota After Hours. Will be on October 8th. And John Hunter, the founder of Twin Cities Native Lacrosse, will talk about lacrosse as an indigenous sport and the history behind that. And I see a comment here from Anne, thanking you from the background story. It was really great. And then she wants to go back and see the island and fort again. And so am I. So you'll get new visitors, I'm sure, in the next for next summer. So if that's it for the comment, I'll thank you everyone, and thank you, Craig, again, and have a nice evening.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.